Rejected with her 3 sons, the widow heard the cowboy say, "You're home now." The skill file was for front-end design, which isn't relevant here. Let me write your script directly. She had nothing left. No home, no husband, no place that would have her. Just 3 little boys holding her hands and a door that had just been shut in her face. If you have ever felt like the world decided you were too much trouble, this story is for you. Stay with me, because what happens next will remind you that the right home finds you when you least expect it. There is something about a woman who has been broken by life but still gets up every morning for her children. Something that quiet, something that strong. It does not go unnoticed forever. Not in this story. Before we begin, if you love slow, warm, emotional Western romance stories about second chances and finding where you truly belong, make sure you subscribe and leave a comment below. Tell me where you are watching from. I read every single one. Now let me tell you about Clara Whitmore. Clara was 34 years old the morning she stood on the porch of her late husband's brother's house with 3 boys at her side and 1 small trunk at her feet. Her oldest, Daniel, was 9. The middle one, Samuel, was 7, and little Eli, who still sometimes cried at night asking for his papa, had just turned 5. It had been 8 months since Thomas died. A horse had thrown him on a cold November morning, and just like that, the man she had built her entire life around was gone. She had spent those 8 months trying to hold things together on the small piece of land they had rented together. But the landlord had no patience for widows who could not pay on time, and by spring, the rent was 2 months behind, and the garden was barely giving enough to feed 3 hungry boys. She had written to Thomas's brother Gerald in Callum County. She had written carefully, humbly, asking only for a little time and a little space to get back on her feet. Gerald had written back and said, "Yes, come on ahead." So Clara had packed everything that mattered into 1 trunk, held her boys close on a long wagon ride across 2 counties, and arrived at Gerald's door with hope still quietly alive somewhere in her chest. Gerald's wife, Marion, opened the door, and the way Marion looked at Clara and those 3 boys told her everything she needed to know before a single word was spoken. Marion had narrow eyes and a tight mouth, and she was the kind of woman who kept a very careful count of what things cost. She looked at Eli's worn shoes and Samuel's patched coat and Daniel's too serious face, and she took a slow breath through her nose like she was already calculating the burden of it all. Gerald appeared behind her. He would not meet Clara's eyes. Marion said they had thought about it more and the house was just too small. She said it kindly enough, the way people say cruel things when they want to still think well of themselves. She said maybe Clara had other family she could turn to. She said she was sorry. The door closed. Clara stood there for a long moment. The spring wind moved across the porch, and Eli pressed his small face against her side. Daniel, who was 9 and already too old for his age, reached down and picked up the trunk handle without being asked. Samuel just looked up at his mother with those big, quiet eyes that always trusted her to know what to do. Clara did not cry. She could not afford to cry. She walked them back down the road and sat them on a fence post near the edge of town while she tried to think. She had a little money. Very little. Enough for maybe a week at a boarding house if the rate was fair. She had no family left of her own, no one she could call on, no plan. She had 3 boys who needed supper and a roof. That was when she saw the notice. It was pinned to the post of the general store across the road. Half the words had faded from weather, but she could still read the main of it. A rancher outside of Harrow Creek was seeking a housekeeper, room and board included. The notice was signed with a name, Nate Calloway. Clara read it twice. Then she looked at her boys. Then she looked at the little money in her purse. She walked into the general store and asked the owner if the notice was still good. The man behind the counter looked at her and then looked through the window at the 3 boys sitting on the fence. He rubbed the back of his neck and said he believed Nate was still looking, far as he knew, but that Nate was a particular kind of man. "Quiet," he said. Kept to himself since his wife passed. He said Nate had a daughter about 7 years old who had not spoken a word in nearly 2 years. Clara asked where the ranch was. The man gave her directions and said he hoped it worked out for her. He said it in a way that meant he was not sure it would. The road to the Calloway Ranch was long and dry, and the afternoon sun sat heavy on Clara's shoulders as she walked it with the boys. Daniel carried the trunk with her. Samuel and Eli walked without complaint, though Eli's small legs were tired and he held Clara's hand very tight. The ranch appeared around a bend in the road like something out of a quiet painting. It was not fancy, it was not grand, but it was solid and real, with a proper barn and a garden that had good bones to it, even if it had been neglected, and a wide-covered porch that wrapped around the front of the house. A man was at the fence when they came up the road. He had his back to them, working a post that had come loose. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, with dark hair that had gone a little long past his collar. He moved with the kind of slow deliberateness that comes from a man who does not waste motion. He heard them on the road and turned. His face was weathered and serious, and there were lines around his eyes that had not come from laughing. He looked at Clara, then he looked at the boys. He looked at the trunk. He looked back at Clara. He said nothing for a moment. Clara spoke first. She told him her name. She told him she had seen his notice. She told him she was a hard worker and a good cook, and she could keep a house and tend a garden, and she would not be any trouble. Her voice was steady, but her hands were not. She kept them pressed together in front of her so he would not see. The man looked at the three boys again. Daniel was standing straight, trying to look older than 9. Samuel had his hands in his pockets. Eli had stepped slightly behind Clara's skirt. The man said his name was Nate Calloway. He said the notice had said housekeeper. He said he had not thought about there being children. Clara said she understood. She said she was sorry to have walked all this way for nothing. She turned to gather the boys. He said, "Wait." She turned back. He looked at her for a long moment, then out at the land, then back at her. He said he had a daughter inside who had not eaten a proper meal in 3 days because she kept pushing food away and he did not know what to do about it. He said the house was a mess. He said the garden had not been tended since the fall. He said he did not know the first thing about managing a household, and the ranch was taking all of him just to keep it running. He said the room was a back room, big enough for her and the boys if they did not mind close quarters. He said the pay would not be much, but board and meals were included, and she was welcome to tend whatever corner of the garden she liked for her own use. He said he was not an easy man to be around. He said he liked quiet, and he kept his own hours, and he did not want any fuss. Clara said she had 3 boys. She said they were good boys, but they were boys. She said there would be some noise. Something moved in his face. It was not quite a smile, but it was close to one. He said he supposed he had grown too used to the quiet anyway. He opened the gate. The inside of the house was exactly as he had described. Dishes in the basin, dust on the windowsills, a table that had not been properly wiped in some time. Clara could see the shape of what the house had once been. There were curtains that a woman had sewn, good ones, and a braided rug near the door that had been made with care. The bones of a loved home were still there underneath the neglect. The little girl was sitting at the kitchen table when they came in. She was small for 7, with her father's dark hair and very large brown eyes that watched everything and said nothing. She looked at Clara. She looked at the boys. She looked back at her plate where a piece of bread sat untouched. Clara sat down across from her without asking permission and without any fanfare at all. She said her name was Clara. She said the tall one was Daniel, and he was very serious about horses. Could she believe it? She said the one with the freckles was Samuel, and he could eat more biscuits than any person had a right to. She said the little one hiding behind her was Eli, and he was very brave, except sometimes he was not. Eli peeked around her and looked at the little girl. Clara asked the little girl if she liked biscuits, because she was planning to make some tomorrow morning, and she needed to know how many to make. The little girl did not speak, but she looked at the bread on her plate, and then, very slowly, she picked it up and took a small bite. Nate Calloway was standing in the doorway watching all of this. Clara did not look at him, but she felt the change in the room, the way a man breathes differently when something surprises him. She asked Nate the little girl's name. He said it was Rose. Clara looked at Rose and said that was a beautiful name. She said she had always loved roses. She said tomorrow she was going to see what could be done about the garden, and maybe, if Rose felt like it, she could come outside and help. Rose looked at her for a long moment. Then she took another bite of bread. The first week was not easy. The house took real work to put right, and the boys needed watching, and the routine of a new place was strange for everyone. Eli woke crying 2 nights in a row. Daniel and Samuel bickered about sleeping space. The kitchen stove had a flue that needed cleaning, and the garden was more overgrown than it had looked from the road. But Clara worked. She worked from before the sun was up until after it went down. She scrubbed and mended and planted and cooked, and she did it all without complaint and without asking for praise. Nate watched from a distance. He was a man who showed nothing easily. He came in for meals and ate what was put in front of him and said it was good and went back out. He gave the boys wide berth, but he was not unkind to them. Once she caught him showing Daniel how to check a horse's hoof for stone bruising. He did not know she was watching. He was patient and thorough, and his voice was low and careful. She wondered about his wife. She did not ask. Rose began to follow Clara around the garden on the 3rd day. She did not speak, but she helped. She pulled weeds with small, serious hands and handed Clara the trowel when she needed it, and watched everything Clara did with those big, quiet eyes. On the 5th evening, Rose came and sat beside Eli on the porch steps, while the boys were watching the sunset. Eli told Rose a long, rambling story about a frog he had seen near the creek, and Rose listened to every word. She did not respond. But when Eli got to the part about the frog jumping onto his boot, the smallest sound came out of her, something between a breath and a laugh. Eli beamed at her like she had handed him a gift. That night Nate came in late and found Clara sitting at the kitchen table by the lamp, mending one of Samuel's shirts. He poured himself a cup of water and stood at the window for a moment. Then he said he had heard Rose make a sound today. He said the woman from town had told him maybe Rose would never talk again. He said he had started to believe her. Clara said children had their own timing. She said sometimes they needed to be in a place where they felt safe before they could find their voice again. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Thank you." Just those 2 words. But the way he said them was the way a man says something he's been carrying for a long time and is finally setting down. 6 weeks in, the trouble came. It came in the form of Thomas Greer, who owned the land east of Nate's property and who had been trying for 3 years to push the boundary line in his favor. He came with a paper he claimed was a survey and 2 men who worked for him and a mouthful of legal-sounding words. Nate met him at the fence line. Clara watched from the garden. She could see the set of Nate's shoulders, the stillness in him that was not calm but was something quieter and more dangerous than anger. Greer looked past Nate toward the house and saw Clara in the garden with the children, and something mean and calculating moved across his face. He said something to Nate that she could not hear, but she saw Nate go very still. He came back to the house that evening and told her what Greer had said. That a man alone with a hired woman and a bunch of strange children looked like a man who could not manage his affairs. That there were people in town already talking. That Greer was going to use it, the talk, to push the county office to look more closely at the property question. Clara sat with that for a moment. Then she asked Nate what he wanted to do about it. He looked at the table. He said he had been thinking. He said he was not a man who said things he did not mean. He said what he was about to say was practical more than anything else, but he wanted her to know he meant it with respect. He said if she was willing, a legal marriage would silence the talk and protect the land and give her boys a proper household standing. He said he was not asking for anything more than what they already had. He said she could take all the time she needed to think about it. Clara thought about Marion shutting that door. She thought about sleeping in that back room with her 3 boys and the safety of a roof that did not feel borrowed. She thought about Rose, who had laughed at Eli's frog story. She thought about this man who showed Daniel how to check a horse's hoof without being asked. She said she would marry him. He nodded. He said it would be a simple ceremony in town. He said nothing would change in the house unless she wanted it to. She said she understood. But something had already changed. She could feel it in the way he looked at her when he thought she was not looking. She could feel it in herself, in the warmth that came into her chest when she heard his boots on the porch in the evening. She was not ready to name it, but it was there. They married on a Thursday at the county office with the boys in their best shirts, and Rose holding a small bunch of wildflowers that Eli had picked for her from the meadow. It was quiet and simple, and the judge said the words, and Nate put a plain band on her finger, and that was that. On the walk back to the wagon, Daniel walked beside Nate without being asked, not touching, just beside him. Nate noticed. He did not say anything, but he slowed his pace to match the boys. Clara saw it and had to look away. 3 weeks after the wedding, the trouble with Greer came to a head. He brought the county land official out to the fence line on a Tuesday morning when the sky looked like rain. Clara was in the house with the children when she heard the voices. She sent the boys to the back room and told Rose to stay inside, and she went out to the porch. Nate was alone against 3 men. She walked out to the fence line and stood beside him. Greer looked at her with that mean calculation in his eyes and said a woman had no standing in a land dispute. Clara said she was the legal wife of this property, and she had standing to be exactly where she was standing. She said, furthermore, she had copies of the original deed and the water rights agreement in the house, and if the county official would like to see them, she would be happy to provide them. And if the line as drawn on those documents was different from the line on Greer's paper, then perhaps the county official might want to know why. There was a silence. The county official looked at Greer. He said he would, in fact, like to see those documents. Nate looked at her, just for a moment. There was something in his face she had not seen there before. It moved through her like warm water. Greer left without the land. That evening, after the boys were in bed and Rose had fallen asleep clutching the small rag doll she had started carrying again, Clara was washing up at the basin when Nate came and stood in the doorway. He said he had not expected her to come out there. She said she had not planned to. She just had. He was quiet for a moment. Then he came and stood beside her at the basin and picked up the dish she had washed and dried it, the way a man does when words are not coming easily and he needs his hands to be doing something. He said he had been a long time without light in this house. He said he had gotten used to the dark and told himself it was fine. He said he had not expected anyone to just walk in and start making things bright again without asking. Clara kept her hands in the water. He said he knew the arrangement was supposed to be practical. He said he knew she had not asked for more than a safe place for her children. He said he was not trying to complicate things. He said, but... He stopped. She waited. He said, but he had been sitting with something for a while, and he thought she deserved to hear it said plainly. He said she was the bravest woman he had ever seen. He said she'd walked up this road with 3 boys and 1 trunk and more dignity than most people managed with a full house behind them. He said he did not know what he had done to deserve that she had stayed and made this place feel like a home again. He said he thought he might be falling in love with her. He said he thought he had been for a while, and he was sorry if it was too much or too soon. Clara turned and looked at him. She said it was not too much. She said she had been afraid for a long time that she was not the kind of woman a man looked at twice, that she was too tired, too worn, Too much trouble with her 3 boys and her sad eyes and her one small trunk. She said, but when she was standing at that fence line beside him today, she had not felt like too much trouble. She had felt like exactly enough. He reached out and took her hand, carefully, like something he did not want to break. She let him. It was a Sunday morning in September when it happened. Clara was making breakfast, and the boys were doing their morning chores in the barn, and Nate had gone out to check the fence on the north side. Rose came into the kitchen. She stood in the doorway for a moment, watching Clara at the stove. Clara smiled at her and asked if she had slept well. Rose walked very slowly across the kitchen and stood beside Clara at the stove. She looked up at her, those big brown eyes holding something that had been building for a long time. Then, in a voice that was small and rough from not being used, Rose said one word. She said, "Mama." Clara went very still. Rose said it again. "Mama." Clara set down the spoon in her hand and knelt down so she was at Rose's level, and she looked at this little girl who had been so quiet for so long, and she felt something open up in her chest so wide it almost hurt. She pulled Rose into her arms and held her. She did not say anything for a moment. She just held her. Then she said she was right here. She said she was not going anywhere. She said Rose was her girl, and she was not going anywhere ever. Nate heard it from the porch. He had come back early from the fence line and stopped at the porch steps when he heard Rose's voice. Clara heard the porch boards creak as he stood there, and she did not need to look to know what was on his face. She could feel it from across the room. The boys came in from the barn, and Samuel saw Rose crying in Clara's arms and came over and put his hand on Rose's back very gently, the way children do when they know something important is happening, even if they do not fully understand it. Eli looked at Rose, and then at his mother, and then at Nate, standing in the doorway. He walked over to Nate, tipped his head back, and looked up at him, and asked if he was going to come eat breakfast too. Nate looked down at this small boy who had been afraid of him for weeks, and had come to him so matter-of-factly on this particular morning, and something in his face finally, completely came undone. He said yes. He said he was going to come eat breakfast. He stepped inside. They found their life together slowly, the way good things are built. Not all at once, but piece by piece, morning after morning, shared meal after shared meal. Daniel learned to ride properly under Nate's teaching, and his serious face broke open into something like joy the first time he brought a horse around the yard on his own. Samuel decided that Nate was a good man, primarily because Nate had once let him name a new calf and had used the name Samuel chose without any argument. Eli simply and completely adopted Nate as his own. He followed him around the ranch the way a small shadow follows the thing that makes it. Rose spoke more with each passing week. At first single words, then small sentences. Then one evening at supper, she told a story about something that had happened in the garden, and she did not stop talking for 5 whole minutes, and everyone at the table went very still and quiet so as not to interrupt her. And when she was done, Eli clapped. By winter, the house was full in a way it had not been in years. There were boots by the door in 4 different sizes. There was noise in the morning and noise in the evening, and sometimes in between. The kitchen smelled like biscuits and wood smoke, and the braided rug near the door had been worn smooth from so many feet. Clara and Nate sat together on the porch on cold evenings sometimes, after the children were in bed, wrapped in quilts, watching the stars over the land. They did not always talk. They did not need to. There was a comfort between them that did not require filling. One of those evenings, Clara said she had not believed for a long time that she would ever feel safe again. She said safe was a thing she had stopped hoping for after Thomas died. She said she had just been trying to keep moving. Nate said he understood that. He said he had been the same, just keeping moving. He said, but there was a difference between moving to survive and moving toward something. He reached over and took her hand under the quilt. He said he was glad she had walked up that road. She said she was glad he had opened the gate. He looked at her, and he said the words then, clear and plain the way this man said the things he meant. He said she was home now. He said this was her home, and those were her children in that house, and this was her land, and he loved her, and he was not interested in a world where she was ever made to feel unwanted again. Clara looked out at the dark land and the cold stars, and felt something she had nearly forgotten the shape of. She felt like she belonged somewhere. She felt like she was home. If this story touched your heart, I would love to hear from you in the comments below. Tell me what moments stayed with you the most. Was it Rose saying mama for the first time? Was it Eli asking Nate to come eat breakfast? Or was it Clara standing at that fence line? Tell me. And tell me where you're watching from tonight, because I love knowing where these stories find their way to. If you are new here, please subscribe and stay a while. Every story I write is made for the ones who need reminding that it is not too late, that the right door will open, and that somewhere out there is a porch and a quilt and a hand that will reach for yours. Thank you for watching. I will see you in the next story.